The screams still echo in my ears, even after all these years. That night, I saw things no one should see. I remember crouching behind the bougainvillea hedge, my legs trembling in fear. The man's voice boomed like thunder, his rich baritone echoing through the quiet compound. His wife's cries broke my heart, raw, desperate, and piercing. I can't forget how she clutched her swollen belly, her Ankara gown bright with reds and blues contrasting against the darkness of the night. I'll tell you how it began, but let me warn you, this story doesn't have a happy ending. The story of Alhaji Musa and his wife Halima was something that haunted me for years. It wasn't just about the tragedy that unfolded in their home, but also about the darkness that lurked behind closed doors. Alhaji Musa, once a well-respected and wealthy businessman, had a life that seemed perfect from the outside. But no one knew about the terrible things that happened behind his mansion's gates. I was one of the few who witnessed it all. How his anger consumed him, how he treated his pregnant wife, and the tragedy that followed. Alhaji Musa was a man of wealth, known for his power and influence. He had flashy cars, a beautiful mansion, and a wife, Halima, who was carrying their first child. They were the perfect picture of success. Halima always wore bright Ankara clothes, her braided hair adorned with beads that jingled softly whenever she moved. Alhaji, dressed in expensive suits, made his way through the village with a sense of arrogance, as though the world was his to command. But it wasn't long before cracks began to show in their marriage. Halima's pregnancy began to take a toll on her health, and her once joyful and energetic spirit began to fade. She grew tired, weak, and sick often. But Alhaji, who was used to being in control, showed little sympathy. His anger flared more frequently, and his patience wore thin. He began to criticize her for not being strong enough to carry out the household chores and help with the business. His temper was like a ticking time bomb, always threatening to explode. One evening, after a particularly long day, Halima was struggling to prepare a meal when Alhaji came home. He walked in, his eyes already filled with anger. "Why isn't the house ready? Why aren't you working harder? What's wrong with you?" he shouted. Halima, in her fragile state, tried to explain that she was feeling unwell, but Alhaji wouldn't listen. He stormed off, his harsh words lingering in the air. It was then that I saw something dark in him, something that I had never noticed before. As the days went by, Alhaji's anger only grew. I often heard him shouting at Halima from the next room. His temper seemed to have no limit, and I was terrified of what might happen next. One night, I was passing by their house when I heard loud banging and Halima's cries. I wanted to go in and help, but I knew better. Alhaji had a way of making people feel small, and I feared what would happen if I interfered. So, I stood outside in the dark, helpless, listening to the sounds of their broken marriage. The next morning, things seemed to settle down. Halima was still fragile, but she tried to act as though everything was fine. She wore a bright Ankara dress, her hair braided neatly, but I could see the pain in her eyes, the exhaustion that never seemed to leave her. I noticed that she had started to hide herself more, avoiding Alhaji's gaze, speaking less, and spending more time alone in a room. It was as if She had accepted that this was her life now, and there was no way out. One evening, everything changed. Halima had been in bed trying to rest when Alhaji barged into the room, furious over something trivial. He began yelling at her, blaming her for all his problems. His voice grew louder, and the anger in his eyes intensified. Without warning, he grabbed her by the arm and shoved her across the room. I heard a sickening thud as she hit the wall. My heart sank as I realized the cruelty of this man, how far he had gone. Halima collapsed on the floor, clutching her stomach. Her face was pale and tears streamed down her cheeks. I rushed to her Baidower's side, but Alhaji stopped me with a single furious look. "Mind your business," he spat, his voice like poison. I could see the fear in Halima's eyes as she reached out for me, silently begging for help. But there was nothing I could do. Alhaji had made it clear that no one was allowed to interfere. The rest of that night passed in silence, but I could feel the weight of what had just happened hanging in the air. The villagers began to notice the changes in Halima. She was no longer the bright, cheerful woman they had known. She became withdrawn, often seen wandering the streets with a distant look in her eyes. The whispers started. People began to talk about how Alhaji had become cruel, how he treated his wife, but no one dared to confront him. They feared him too much. I too remained silent, even though I couldn't stand the sight of his abuse anymore. As the days went by, Alhaji's anger grew more unpredictable. I witnessed one of his outbursts again, this time in public. He berated a servant for a small mistake, shouting at him so loudly that everyone in the market stopped to watch. His face turned red with fury. His voice thundered through the streets. No one dared intervene. Alhaji had always been a man to be feared, but now he was something darker, someone who could break anyone around him with just a glance. It was a few weeks later that tragedy struck. Halima suffered a miscarriage. The stress of the abuse, combined with her frail health, had taken its toll on her body. She was rushed to the hospital, but it was too late. The baby was gone. Alhaji's reaction was cold, even apathetic. He didn't cry. He didn't show any emotion at all. He simply stared blankly, as though his wife's pain didn't matter to him. I saw Halima's heartbreak in the way she clutched her empty womb. But Alhaji didn't seem to care. Halima's death came soon after. She died from the complications of her miscarriage, her body too weak to withstand the years of mistreatment. Alhaji didn't even attend her funeral. He stayed in his mansion, shut away from the world. The villagers, however, gathered in sorrow, mourning the loss of the woman who had once been the heart of their community. They spoke of her kindness, her strength, and how she had been failed by the man she loved. After Halima's death, Alhaji's life began to unravel. His businesses collapsed, his wealth dwindled, and his health began to fail. He became a shell of the man he once was, haunted by guilt, but too proud to admit it. The once powerful businessman was now alone, abandoned by those who once respected him. His mansion, once filled with laughter and guests, became empty and quiet, a reminder of the life he had destroyed. Rumors began to spread about Alhaji's downfall. People said that the gods were punishing him for his cruelty. They spoke of the spirits of the past haunting his mansion and the consequences of his mistreatment of Halima. Some even claimed to hear strange noises coming from the house at night, banging sounds, as though someone was trapped inside. Others believed that Alhaji was being driven mad by guilt. tormented by his actions. One evening, I received a visit from a neighbor who had once worked for Alhaji. She told me that Alhaji's behavior had become more erratic. He no longer left the house, and when he did, it was only to wander the streets, muttering to himself. His once pristine appearance had deteriorated. His clothes were stained and his face was gaunt. He seemed to be slowly losing his mind. I knew then that the consequences of his actions had come full circle. When I visited Alhaji's home, I was shocked by what I saw. He was sitting in his living room, staring blankly at the wall. His once sturdy frame had withered away, his face haggard and pale. He looked like a man who had given up on everything. "What have I done?" he muttered, his voice hoarse and broken. His words sent a shiver down my spine. It was as though he had finally realized the full extent of his cruelty, but it was too late to make amends. Alhaji's downward spiral continued with the mysterious death of his housekeeper. She had been a loyal servant, but one evening her body was found in the garden, lifeless and cold. The cause of her death was never clear. Some believed she had taken her own life. Others thought it might have been foul play, but no one could say for sure. Alhaji, however, showed no emotion. He simply stared at her lifeless body, his eyes empty, as if he had lost all capacity for sorrow. Alhaji's downfall was complete. His wealth had all but vanished. His businesses were in ruins and his reputation was in tatters. He had become a cautionary tale, a man whose riches had only brought him misery. His mansion, once a symbol of success, was now a crumbling monument to his greed and cruelty. The once proud Alhaji Musa was now a shadow of his former self, broken by the consequences of his actions. I often think about what happened to Alhaji and Halima. I think about how different things might have been if someone had stepped in sooner, but no one dared confront Alhaji. We were all too afraid of him. The fear of his wealth and power kept us silent, even when we saw what he was doing to his wife. I sometimes wonder if Halima might still be alive today if we had done something to stop him, but there was one small glimmer of hope left in the world. Halima's daughter, Zainab, had survived the tragedy. After her mother's death, she was taken in by a kind-hearted family who raised her with love and care. Zainab was a reminder that despite the darkness in her father's heart, there was still a chance for a better future. She grew up to be a strong, compassionate young woman, named after her mother. Zainab grew up with a deep sense of kindness and empathy, something that had been sorely lacking in her father's household. She was loved by everyone who met her, and she carried the memory of her mother with her every day. Her life was one of hope, of resilience, and of healing. I made sure to visit her often, sharing stories of her mother's strength and grace, hoping that she would never forget the woman who had suffered so much. Years passed, and Alhaji Musa became little more than a forgotten legend in the village. His mansion was sold off to a new family, who were unaware of the dark history it held. The story of his cruelty lived on though, passed down through whispers and hushed conversations. His wealth, once so coveted, had been his undoing, leaving behind only the scars of his actions. Zainab grew into a young woman, full of potential. She had inherited her mother's beauty, but more importantly, her kindness. I often thought about Halima and what she might have become had she been given the chance to live a life free from pain. But through Zainab, her memory lived on. The lessons she had taught us of love, strength, and resilience were not forgotten. Zainab's future was bright. She was determined to make a difference in the world, to create a life full of love and kindness. As she grew older, I saw the woman she was becoming, a woman who would never repeat the mistakes of her father, who would never allow cruelty to take root in her life. She was the living proof that even in the face of darkness, light could still shine through. Alhaji Musa's legacy was one of regret and sorrow, a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power and cruelty. But through his daughter, his legacy was rewritten. Zainab's strength and compassion became the true legacy of the Musa family, a legacy that was built on love and hope, not fear and hatred. The story of Alhaji Musa ended with his death, a death that was as quiet and unnoticed as his life had become. The village moved on, and the mansion where so much pain had been inflicted was finally empty. The new family who moved in had no idea of the darkness that had once lived there. But for those of us who had lived through it, we would never forget. Looking back, I know I will never forget what happened to Halima and Alhaji Musa. Their story is one of tragedy, but also one of hope. It serves as a reminder that we must never allow cruelty to go unchecked, that we must always stand up for those who cannot stand up for themselves. And it reminds us that even in the darkest of times, there is always a chance for redemption and healing.